the stricken battleship heeled over to port. Within 4 minutes of being hit, her after magazine blew up. She sank with a loss of 859 lives.
Our story begins not in the icy waters of the Black Sea, but in the warm Mediterranean sun of 1911. In an Italian shipyard, workers are putting the finishing touches on a magnificent warship, the Giulio Cesare, named after Julius Caesar himself. 577 feet of Italian engineering pride, 13 massive 12-inch guns, built to rule the Mediterranean. But like her famous namesake, this ship's destiny would be written in betrayal and blood. For the next 3 decades, the Giulio Cesare served Italy through world wars, modernizations, and the rise of Mussolini. She survived British battleship shells at impossible ranges, 24,000 meters, one of the longest successful shots in naval history. She dodged British bombers at Taranto. She was a survivor. But in 1943, everything changed. Italy surrendered. And suddenly, this proud warship became a prize in a much deadlier game, the emerging Cold War. Picture this, 1947, 4 powerful nations sitting around a table deciding the fate of Italy's naval treasures: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. They're not negotiating, they're gambling, literally. The Soviets draw Lot C. Congratulations, comrades, you just won yourself a 36-year-old Italian battleship. The Italians were furious. Prince Giulio Valerio Borghese, Italy's legendary naval commando leader, the man they called the Black Prince, he was particularly vocal in his opposition. Some Italian sailors even tried to sabotage their own ship rather than hand her over to the Soviets. But remember that name, Prince Borghese, because he's going to become very important to our story. February 6, 1949, the Albanian port of Vlorë. Soviet sailors march aboard the Giulio Cesare and raise the red naval ensign. The Italian battleship is dead. Long live the Novorossiysk. But here's the thing about trying to turn an Italian ship into a Soviet flagship. It's harder than it sounds. The Soviet crews couldn't read the Italian labels. The ship was in terrible condition beneath her fresh coat of paint. And she was old, really old. Most navies would have scrapped her, but not the Soviets. Between 1949 and 1955, they poured an astronomical amount of money into this ship. 8 complete refits. 8. They replaced her engines, her guns, her electronics. They were determined to make her the pride of the Black Sea Fleet. But here's what the engineers were whispering about in their reports. All these modifications were making the ship heavier, less stable, more dangerous. These warnings went straight to the top, and they were completely ignored. By 1955, the Novorossiysk had become exactly what Stalin wanted, a symbol of Soviet naval power. 44 years old, but still impressive enough to rattle NATO when she sailed toward Turkey in 1950. Still powerful enough that the Soviets were planning to arm her with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons on a ship that was already showing her age. What could possibly go wrong? October 28, 1955. Evening, the Novorossiysk returns to Sevastopol after routine exercises. 1,500 men aboard, regular crew, plus 200 naval cadets who've come for training. The ship's commander, Captain Kukta, has gone ashore for the evening. His second-in-command, Captain Kurshadov, is in charge. The massive battleship takes her position at buoy number 3, about 360 feet from shore. The water beneath her hull is 56 feet deep. Below that, 98 feet of thick, viscous mud. Now here's where things get interesting. On this particular night, an unusual number of security measures have been, let's call them, relaxed. The anti-torpedo net that normally protects the harbor? Removed for repairs. The harbor defense boom that keeps unwanted visitors out? Wide open. The critical hydroacoustic listening station that monitors for underwater threats? It's been non-operational for 11 hours. Oh, and the patrol boat whose entire job is to watch for underwater saboteurs? It's sitting at the dock, not patrolling, just sitting there. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe someone wanted to make sure the Novorossiysk was as vulnerable as possible on this particular night. Most of the crew is asleep. Night watch is quiet. Just another routine evening in the Soviet Navy's most secure harbor. 1:31 a.m. A massive explosion rips through the starboard bow of the Novorossiysk. The blast tears a hole in the underwater hull bigger than 1,600 square feet. Hull plates are bent inward by up to 10 feet. Seawater begins pouring in. Captain Kurshadov is thrown against a bulkhead as the deck lurches beneath him. Through the chaos of blaring alarms and panicked voices, his mind races. What the hell just happened to his ship? Within 3 minutes, just 3 minutes, the battleship develops a dangerous trim by the bow. She's taking on water fast. By 1:40, Fleet Command has been notified. By 2 a.m., tugboats are racing to the scene. But here's where the tragedy becomes a disaster, and it's all because of one man's decision. Vice Admiral Parkhomenko, the Black Sea Fleet Commander-in-Chief, arrives on scene and takes charge. By 3:30 a.m., about 800 sailors not involved in damage control have assembled on deck. Rescue vessels are standing by. Rear Admiral Nikolsky suggests transferring these men to safety. Parkhomenko refuses. He believes the ship can still be saved. All hands must remain aboard. 3:50 a.m. The ship lists to 10 degrees. Naval architects know that 20 degrees is the point of no return for a ship like this. Admiral Nikolsky pleads again for evacuation. Again, Parkhomenko refuses. 4:10 a.m. The list reaches 17 degrees. They're running out of time. 20 minutes later, after taking on more than 7,700 tons of seawater, the Novorossiysk reaches the fatal 20-degree list. The massive battleship sways once to starboard, then violently rolls to port. In just minutes, she's lying on her side, masts and superstructure resting on the harbor bottom. 609 men are dead. The Soviet Navy's worst peacetime catastrophe is complete. But the most heartbreaking detail? For 2 days after the sinking, rescuers could hear tapping from inside the overturned hull. Men were still alive in there, trapped in air pockets, desperately trying to signal for help. Only 9 men were ever rescued from inside that steel tomb. Within days, Moscow dispatched a high-level investigation team. Leading it was Vyacheslav Malyshev, deputy chairman of the USSR Council of Ministers, a brilliant engineer known for his honesty and technical expertise. Here's an interesting detail. Malyshev had actually examined the Giulio Cesare's blueprints back in 1946 and advised against acquiring the aging battleship. Stalin himself had overruled him. The investigation moved with extraordinary speed. Just 2.5 weeks later, they had their answer. An external underwater explosion of a charge equivalent to 2,200 to 2,600 pounds of TNT. The culprit, a leftover German mine from World War II. It made sense. The Germans had heavily mined Sevastopol during the war. Soviet minesweepers had been clearing them for years, but it was possible some had been missed. When they swept the area after the disaster, they found 19 additional German mines, 3 of them less than 165 feet from where the Novorossiysk had been moored. Case closed. Tragic accident. Move along, comrades. But as the years passed, naval experts began to ask uncomfortable questions, questions that would shatter the official narrative. The first problem with the German mine theory was simple: time. The Type RMH mine the Soviets blamed had an operational life of 7 years maximum, 9 at the absolute outside. The disaster happened in 1955, more than 10 years after the end of World War II. The mine's battery would have been dead. The magnetic fuse wouldn't have worked. It should have been just a lump of harmless metal on the seafloor. Then there was the usage history of buoy number 3. Between 1945 and 1953, this exact mooring point had been used 135 times by various vessels. The Novorossiysk herself had anchored there 10 times before without incident. If there was an active mine down there, why hadn't it exploded during any of those previous moorings? The timing was wrong, too. German mines were designed to explode either immediately or after a 6-hour delay. But the explosion occurred 9 hours after the Novorossiysk had anchored. That didn't fit the pattern. And then there were the survivors' accounts. Before the explosion, they heard a low rumble and scraping sound. That's not how mines spontaneously detonate. When divers examined the wreck, they found 2 distinct craters beneath where the ship had been moored. 2 separate explosions, not one. The amount of mud blown into the hull suggested the blast had originated well beneath the harbor bottom, not directly against the hull. And here's the kicker. When they finally raised the wreck in 1957, they couldn't find any fragments of a mine casing, detonator, or other components that should have remained after such an explosion. So if it wasn't a German mine, what destroyed the Novorossiysk? Remember Prince Giulio Valerio Borghese, the Italian naval commando who had been so vocal in his opposition to giving the Giulio Cesare to the Soviets? Well, he wasn't just any naval officer. They called him the Black Prince. During World War II, he commanded Italy's legendary 10th Assault Vehicle Flotilla. These weren't regular sailors. They were underwater commandos, masters of stealth and sabotage. In December 1941, Borghese's frogmen had secretly penetrated the heavily guarded British naval base at Alexandria, Egypt. They attached limpet mines to the battleships HMS Valiant and HMS Queen Elizabeth, severely damaging both vessels. If anyone in the world had the skills to sneak into Sevastopol harbor and destroy a battleship, it was Prince Borghese and his men. According to the theory, when Italy was forced to surrender their beloved Giulio Cesare to the Soviets, Borghese allegedly swore vengeance. One source reported he vowed to avenge such a humiliation of Italy. And here's where it gets interesting. The morning after the explosion, a Soviet patrol boat found a magnetic mine attached to a nearby mooring buoy. The buoy where the cruiser Kerch was scheduled to dock, another formerly Italian ship. The mine was set to explode on November 7th, the Soviet national holiday. Coincidence? Or was someone planning a bigger statement? Years later, in his book about wartime exploits, Borghese included a curious footnote about maneuvers in 1950. The driver also managed to attach the mine to the Caesar, not realizing the ship was manned. Was this a confession hidden in plain sight? But the Italians weren't the only suspects. Another theory pointed to Great Britain and one of their most legendary underwater operatives, Captain Lionel Buster Crabbe. Like Borghese, Crabbe was a master of underwater warfare. During World War II, he had defended Gibraltar against Italian frogman attacks, personally disarming explosive devices planted on Allied ships. He knew underwater demolition better than almost anyone alive. According to some sources, Soviet naval planners were considering equipping the Novorossiysk with nuclear weapons. Imagine that, a nuclear-armed battleship operating in the Mediterranean, potentially capable of striking British targets. British ships were conducting maneuvers in the Aegean Sea in late October 1955, relatively close to the Black Sea. Perfect cover for special operations. And here's the chilling detail. Just 6 months after the Novorossiysk sinking, Captain Crabbe disappeared during an underwater reconnaissance mission. His body was found floating in Portsmouth Harbor 14 months later. The circumstances of his death remain classified to this day. But what if the most disturbing theory is also the most likely? What if the destruction of the Novorossiysk came not from foreign saboteurs, but from within the Soviet system itself. Picture this: 1955. Stalin is dead. The Soviet military establishment is split between competing visions for the future. Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, wants to build a traditional surface fleet centered around battleships like the Novorossiysk. But Nikita Khrushchev has a different vision. He wants submarines, missiles, nuclear capabilities, modern weapons for a modern age. And there's one problem standing in his way: all those old battleships eating up the naval budget. Now, here's an interesting detail. On the night of the explosion, Admiral Kuznetsov was recovering from a heart attack at a Black Sea Fleet sanatorium in Yalta. His recently promoted first deputy, Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, was acting as commander-in-chief of the entire Soviet Navy. Engineer Oleg Sergeyev conducted an extensive technical analysis in the 1990s and reached a startling conclusion. The Novorossiysk had been destroyed by two precisely placed charges with a total TNT equivalent of around 4,000 pounds, planted on the sea bottom near the ship's ammunition magazines. Such precision, Sergeyev argued, could only have been carried out by professionals with intimate knowledge of both explosives and the battleship's vulnerabilities. Remember all those security lapses on the night of the disaster? The removed anti-torpedo net, the deactivated listening station, the opened harbor boom, the patrol boat that stayed in port? Maybe those weren't coincidences that helped foreign saboteurs. Maybe they were deliberate measures to facilitate an internal operation. The aftermath of the disaster certainly advanced the interests of those opposing traditional naval power. Admiral Kuznetsov was fired in 1956, ostensibly for his role in the disaster, even though he'd been in the hospital when it happened. But listen to what Khrushchev said at a Central Committee meeting in 1957. "We were proposed to invest more than 100 billion rubles in the Navy and build old motorboats and destroyers armed with conventional artillery. We made a big effort to fight this," fired Kuznetsov. Everything needs to be evaluated in a modern way. First and foremost, it has to be the submarine fleet, armed with missiles. And Admiral Gorshkov, the man who oversaw the investigation that blamed a German mine? He became commander-in-chief of the Soviet Navy and held that position for an unprecedented 29 years, overseeing the creation of the world's largest nuclear submarine fleet. But perhaps the most telling detail was how the disaster was treated afterward. Unlike other military catastrophes that Soviet propaganda typically transformed into heroic narratives, the Novorossiysk sinking was shrouded in complete secrecy. No monuments were erected, no songs composed, no films produced. The disaster simply vanished from public consciousness as if the state itself wished to forget it had ever happened. In November 1955, the Black Sea Fleet Command had submitted 117 posthumous medal nominations for the crew, plus recommendations for 510 survivors and rescuers who distinguished themselves during the disaster. These honors were never awarded. Researchers later found a note on the document from the chief of the personnel department. Admiral Comrade Gorshkov does not consider it feasible to come forward with this proposal. For 609 dead sailors, there would be no recognition, no remembrance, no justice. For 4 decades, the families of the Novorossiysk dead lived with questions that couldn't be asked and grief that couldn't be publicly expressed. In the Soviet Union, you didn't question official narratives, even when they didn't make sense. Survivors carried their memories in silence. Families mourned in private. The truth, whatever it was, remained locked away in classified files. It wasn't until 1996, 41 years after the disaster and 5 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the Russian government finally began to address this injustice. The original commendation lists were discovered in naval archives. Investigators confirmed that the nominations had been real. 6 sailors had been recommended for the Order of Lenin, 64 for the Order of the Red Banner. hundreds for various medals of valor. Since the Soviet Union no longer existed, all Novorossiysk sailors were awarded the Russian Order of Courage instead. That same year, a monument was finally dedicated at Sevastopol's Brotherhood Cemetery. Survivors and families could finally, openly mourn and remember. But by then, many of those who might have provided answers were already gone, taking their secrets to the grave. So what really happened on that October night in 1955? Was it a leftover German mine that somehow defied the laws of physics and chemistry to explode a decade after its batteries should have died? Was it Italian naval commandos seeking revenge for their lost battleship, carrying out an impossible mission in the heart of Soviet territory? Was it British special forces determined to prevent a nuclear-armed battleship from threatening Western interests? Or was it something even more disturbing? A cold-blooded internal operation designed to eliminate opposition to naval modernization, regardless of the human cost. The full truth may be resting on the bottom of Sevastopol Harbor, 56 feet down in the mud and silt, where the Novorossiysk died her second death. The evidence has been scattered, the witnesses have mostly died, and the classified files may never be fully opened. But what we do know is this. On October 29, 1955, 609 men lost their lives in a tragedy that should never have happened. They deserved better than 4 decades of official silence. They deserved better than convenient explanations that don't hold up to scrutiny. The battleship that was born as Giulio Cesare and died as Novorossiysk carried more than just weapons and armor. She carried the dreams and ambitions of 2 different nations, the hopes of the men who served aboard her, and ultimately, the secrets of those who may have destroyed her. Some mysteries are meant to be solved. Others are meant to remind us that the most dangerous waters aren't always the ones you can see. This story has captivated audiences around the world, sparking intense debate in naval history forums, conspiracy theory communities, and Cold War research circles. Naval historians remain split. Dr. Marina Volkov from the Russian Naval Academy maintains that the German mine explanation, while imperfect, remains the most plausible given the evidence. But Professor James Mitchell from the UK's Naval War College argues that too many coincidences point to human intervention. The question is, whose? Online communities have dissected every detail. Reddit's r/naval history has multiple threads analyzing explosion patterns. YouTube channels dedicated to maritime mysteries have garnered millions of views exploring each theory. The Italian press has been particularly fascinated by the Prince Borghese connection. In 2019, La Gazzetta dello Sport ran a series investigating whether Italian naval records might contain additional clues about covert operations in the 1950s. Russian media, meanwhile, has been more cautious. While acknowledging the inconsistencies in the official explanation, most Russian naval historians prefer to focus on honoring the victims rather than reopening painful questions about possible cover-ups. Perhaps most importantly, families of the victims have finally found a voice. In 2015, on the 60th anniversary of the disaster, descendants of Novorossiysk sailors gathered in Sevastopol for the first public memorial service. Many spoke of their relief that the story was finally being told, even if the truth remains elusive. As one survivor's grandson put it, "We may never know who killed our ship, but at least the world now knows she died."